There you go. Welcome. This is Real Talk, History as a Weapon for Black Liberation with Dr. Sundiata Cha-Jua. Today's guest is Dr. Scot Brown. Dr. Brown is an associate professor in African and Africana Studies at University of California, Los Angeles. He is the author of Fighting for Us, Maulana Karenga, the US Organization, and Black Cultural Nationalism, as well as Discourse on Africana Studies, which is a book about the contributions of James Turner, the longtime director and chair of Africana Studies at Cornell University. Dr. Brown is currently working on a book, and I think this is going to be a magnificent contribution to the discipline. But it's a book on the origins of funk music, looking at Dayton, Ohio, and a group of Black music educators who helped prepare groups like, oh my God, the Ohio Players. How can one forget Honey, Skin Tight? I'm embarrassed. All right, let me bring on Dr. Scot Brown. Okay, Dr. Brown, it's a pleasure,
Good to see you.
pleasure to have you here today.
Good to be with you.
So, Dr. Brown, I always start by asking for biographical information. I've found that it's important to have some commentary about who the guest is, where they come from. So my first question is generally the same for every guest, and it's when and where were you born? And where did you spend your formative years, right? What place did you spend your formative years? And the other part of the question is, how did your class background, the place where you were born, and the time period where you grew up impact your social perspective and your scholarship? So tell us about you.
Sure. I was actually born in Springfield, Massachusetts. My father's side of the family is from the outskirts of Athens, Georgia, and they streamed into the New England area, many of them picking tobacco and then working for the armories during the Second World War. I was born in '66 in Springfield, so I grew up there until I was like around 7. So my whole father's side of the family is actually, many of them, I should say, are in Springfield, Mass. to this day. I was right up the street from the old location of the Basketball Hall of Fame. And then when I was around 7 years old, my mother and father moved to Rochester, New York, where I would say a lot of my formative things happened really in Rochester. And, you know, my parents are both of my parents come from working class backgrounds. If that's generous, because were it not for serving in the Second World War and also all the industries in the Second World War that came about, I think my father's side was much more agricultural in the rural outskirts of Athens. But, you know, all those changes that happened because of industrialization that made northern places a magnet. So my mother and father are two of my heroes, because what they overcame and what they had to deal with being the first generation to go to school, you know, in their families on that level, that was pretty significant. My grandmother, both of my grandparents on my mother's side were deaf as well. So my mother and her two sisters, my late aunt, Shirley Childress Saxton, she was with the group Sweet Honey in the Rock. She's a sign language interpreter. And then my mother's youngest sister, Kaola Martada, is an educator at Indiana Purdue University. She's a professor and a big time administrator there. I don't know her exact title, but you can look her up. She's way up there. But so that whole crew of those sisters were really extraordinary in terms of growing up in Washington, D.C. and in Northeast D.C. and really, really moving themselves to a whole nother level as far as their accomplishment. But my mom and my aunts, sign language was like their first language. So what I learned from having that whole thing in our family memory is that there are dialects, Black dialects of sign language. And
brother, you got to elaborate on that last statement. There are Black dialects in sign language.
That's right. So ASL, American Sign Language, is sort of a standard. If you think about Black vernacular style in speech, right, there are regions. So because of segregation of schools, you have Black teachers who are teaching sign language who maintain certain traditions that are local, but also sign language is very much for Black folks, regional and family oriented. So there are signs in our family that we had that were based on the family history. So one of the signs in my family for grandpa or granddad was this. And that's a sign for overalls, because he was somebody who worked so hard as a mason, carpenter, and all these different skills with his hands. So he's identified as always working. So that's for grandpa. So there are lots of things like that in sign language that are very much mimicking Black vernacular style in speech, actually. So my mom, coming out of that, and my aunts had levels of resiliency that are kind of unmatched. And so the whole story of Black deafness is really yet to be told. My mother has written about it, but that was what drew her to Rochester, because they had the NTID at RIT as a deaf institute, and my mother worked with them. So that was one of the magnets. My father came along too, and then we had to just figure things out in Rochester, New York. And I was 7 or 8. I was very bothered by that, because Springfield I had grandparents. I mean, you mess with me, because Springfield was also very segregated. We were in a all Black neighborhood, actually. When I was growing up, I remember busing was going on because I didn't go to I was being bused somewhere else. And that was sort of an experiment that was going through some real strains in the state of Massachusetts, right? And so, but elementary school, but I just know the neighborhood. I mean, I had cousins. I remember going to the boys club in the neighborhood, and somebody messed with my younger cousin, Dion. I got in his face. I said, well, you gonna mess with him, you gotta mess with me. And he went and got somebody else bigger than me and said, you mess with me, you mess with him, you gotta mess with me. So then I went and got my other cousin, who whooped everybody together. So that's the kind of backup you have if you lose when families move the way they did. So I actually saw that as very disruptive as a kid. So in Rochester, we were in the neighborhood as well. And I think I want to make a distinction between the neighborhood and what we call the hood. Today's hood was today's neighborhood. So
explain the difference.
The difference is the availability of jobs. When you got a job, you got money. And when you got money, there are all kinds of social and cultural consequences. So a lot of times when people talk about romantically, back in the day, we used to have Black businesses. But what they're also missing is there was employment, and there was money to spend in that community. So there were establishments. The record store was around the corner from my house.
That's right.
Which I think they may have given me some records because I bothered them so much. I didn't play guitar yet. I was interested in music. I knew I had something in me, but I couldn't figure out what it was.
Mm-hmm.
I was into pop locking. I was on a neighborhood pop locking team. You know, I don't want to show you my moves quite just yet, but we were serious. And so the neighborhood was a neighborhood school, number 37 school. You walked to school. You had friends that walked with you. So the notion of community wasn't something we had to actually theorize. That's what it was, you know. And I ended up getting myself in some trouble with some fellas, and my mom got me into a program for high school to get me away from the guys I was running around with. That was her perception anyway. I couldn't blame them for what I chose to do. But Jimmy Carter had a solution to what the right wing was called forced busing. And that was called the Urban Suburban Transfer Program, where certain schools could volunteer to take so many kids from the city. So I went to a school just on the outskirts of the northeast side called Irondequoit. Now, so interesting is that segregation still got replicated. All of the black kids from the city, we all took the same buses. We all had our locker in the same part of the hallway. We all sat at the same lunch table together. If you were one of the fellas, you skipped classes on Fridays because they had open gyms, so we would play ball all day. So,
brother, did you say you was from Decatur, Illinois, and went to school with me? Because your experience sounded like my experience.
Yeah. And that's you know what's so funny about that too, Professor Cha-Jua, is that the upstate New York. So you move west, you go Buffalo, then you go further east to Rochester, then you go down to Syracuse. You can almost think of that as Eastern Ohio, because those cities are industrial towns with the architecture like Midwestern towns. There's no row houses in Rochester. Okay, the porch, having a basement, the backyard, it's the same spatial look as a Midwestern town. It has nothing to do with the Eastern Seaboard. You know, which is always funny because people out here in California, I tell them I'm from New York. Yeah, oh yeah, man. I'm like, no, man, I'm not talking about. I'm 400 miles away from New York City where I grew up. So, you know, that's always interesting. But
I think that speaks to it being an industrial town.
Yes.
That type of household architecture is what you see in industrial communities. But go ahead, my brother.
Right. But no, you're right. See, that had everything to do with and I think we have to think about class in an interesting way that has to pull in geography. So if you take, for instance, what people would think is some kind of class differential, education. Well, when I was growing up in the 1970s, the middle class was the working class. People who had money worked at Kodak. Kodak paid more money if you were in the right position, working in the right area, right division. If you got, first of all, Kodak gave out Kodak bonuses. In fact, you see somebody with that new deuce and a quarter, and you knew that was around bonus times. Yeah, I get that bonus. So that was kind of like the identity. If you got there and you could come right out of high school and work at Kodak, oh yeah, you're making some money. My dad was a public defender, and you know, then he worked in the legal area. My mother was working with a not-for-profit, and then got into, you know, local politics and things like that. So that was so interesting because when I went to school in elementary school, you know, people have these ideas of a lawyer. I remember you had that question in class, all the kids, what do your parents do? And I said, my dad's a lawyer. Well, see, the car that we had was a Datsun, which now, you know, gave way to the Nissan. But before the Nissan, it was the Datsun, right?
Yeah.
I remember this kid, and I said, "Ew, man, stop lying. Daddy ain't no lawyer driving that car," because, again, people who were working at Kodak had Cadillacs,
Mm-hmm.
Deuce to the Quarter. They had them big Thunderbirds. I mean, you know, so, and then nicer houses. I remember I gave my parents a fit about why we don't have wall-to-wall carpeting. That was a big deal, man. Wall-to-wall carpeting back in the day, right? That looked good. We didn't have that. So, you know, it's interesting because, so you're talking about an empowered working class. So, and I had no intention on going to college, which was something that my mother wasn't that fond of. I got into playing in bands, and my real cultural education, as far as, you know, developing a sense of confidence, was really from the local musicians in Rochester, the local Black musicians who taught me. There was a band called Chocolate City. And they were the biggest thing in Rochester from the Black band, and they're still, I mean, they're incredible musicians. And then there were like their nieces, their nephews, their the youngsters on their block. Their street was a street where a bunch of the youngsters that followed them was like 2 blocks over. And I used to go over there, and these were kids my age, Mike and Alistair. Those cats were 12 and 13 years old and could play really well because they were taught by older musicians in this band. And those guys in turn taught me, and then I got introduced to other musicians. So, and one thing that was interesting, no one charged us for lessons. No one. It's like, first of all, are you serious? And they show you how hard it is to play, and then it's like, you sure you really want to do this? Yeah. All right, practice this. Or you try to learn songs. Now, I had no ear. I don't know if I was pretty much tone deaf and didn't realize it. And I had no timing. My timing was off. So a lot of times when I was playing bass, I was memorizing things and not hearing it. So some like, Scott, yo, you off, man, you off. I was like, what? Oh, dang, I'm playing in the wrong spot, you know. So it wasn't, my ears didn't come until later, but the band that was called Radiance, in high school, I was playing in nightclubs at the age of 15. And so that result of being in the band world was such that my high school performance was not really college prep to the extent that it could have been. And once I left the band and I started taking part-time classes at the University of Rochester and at the community college, Monroe Community College. And then that's how I got in on probation. I came into the University of Rochester on probation. And eventually then I was able to discover things that my music training would transfer over to things that make one successful in college.
Brother, that is a wonderful story. And I would really like for you to come back at some point and we just talk about growing up, you know, and background and those kinds of things. But I want to move on to my audience. Everybody knows you as a music man, right? Both as a player and as a scholar.
Yeah.
But I want to I want to look at an earlier phase of your scholarship and of your movement activity. So I would be correct if I described you as, at one point, as a Black nationalist, specifically a follower of Keita, a member of the US organization. And so my question is,
I was never a member because being a member of us, you know, that's an entire another level. That's a whole life commitment. I was definitely somebody, but I'll tell the story of how it happened. But no, I was never a member.
Okay. I'm glad. I appreciate that correction because I would have been spreading misinformation.
Don't get in trouble out here. Don't start.
And my friend, I mean, Marlana and I are friends. I respect Marlana. Sure. But you know, we see the world differently.
Sure.
We see the world quite differently. But I respect him. He would have gotten on my case if he had heard that. So we don't want to go there.
Right. But in your case, I just don't want anybody getting on my case, brother. You know what I'm saying?
I hear you, bro. So you're not gonna ride with me on this. Okay. You leave me out there. But is Black nationalism in any of its varieties still an intellectual concern of yours in terms of research? And would you describe yourself politically, ideologically, as some variant of Black nationalism? I know that there's much more discussion about class in your conversation today than, say, man, when did I meet you? 25 years ago?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's much more discussion about class. But how would you describe yourself politically, ideologically? And are you still studying Black nationalism in whatever variety?
Absolutely. I never thought of myself and the critique that I came to as a kind of abandonment or outgrowth of cultural nationalism, Black cultural nationalism. My critique, it's interesting because I was so close to it, and I certainly was an intellectual follower of Maulana Karenga. And I got to Karenga through a bookstore owner who started a Black bookstore. Terry and Gerald Shaka and his wife, Terry Shaka, started the bookstore Kitabu Kingdom. And when I was just starting to really listen to a lot of tapes, I listened to Cress Welsing, listened to Malcolm X tapes, I discovered James Turner. That magnet toward going to Africana Studies came from this bookstore that had all this information. And this brother, Gerald.
Now, what city is this bookstore in?
Rochester, New York.
Rochester, okay.
Yes, it was a fantastic bookstore. Now, I mean, it was more than a bookstore. It was really like a cultural center. And one thing that Shaka said was, because I was good at memorizing tapes and memorizing quips and quotes, he said, but if you're serious, you're going to have to study. So the first book he insisted I had to read was The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. And then he would talk to me about the group he was in called Us, and that he said, which blew my mind, I wasn't quite convinced of it, started this holiday Kwanzaa. Because I started hearing about Kwanzaa when I started going and taking classes. And I took my first trip to Africa in '85. I went to Senegal with a professor at University of Rochester, took a group of us to Africa. So I was aware of it, but I couldn't wrap my head around it being started by an organization. So when I started to research it, and then most of what I got was very different from what Shaka was saying. So everybody else said, heard about this group, Us and Karenga? It was always, yeah, they were the one who had to shoot out with the Panthers, or they were agents, or all this negative stuff. And so I went to see Karenga speak in Buffalo, New York in 1990. I was already really, really into the tapes and the messaging of Kawahita, the cultural critique, cultural analysis, the revolutionary analysis he was making. I was there for it. I even had a shaved head, at one point. I was feeling it. And so I met him in 1990, and either 90 or 91, but I know I was invited eventually out to, I think it was closer to 92 when I met him, in Buffalo. Before that, I met him at a Sheikh Anta Diop conference at Temple University. But after that, around 92, he invited me to the Kawahita Institute, where they do their classes and seminars. So what I liked about Kawahita is what a lot of young people coming into their own like. It had the capacity to explain. It was a macro theory, what I felt explained everything. Now, I had already been into sort of third world Marxism before that. So I started an organization at the University of Rochester called the Committee on Oppression in Latin America and the Caribbean. And, we were really into supporting the Sandinistas, and we were really into, Castro, the Cuban alternative to the American model and foreign policy. And we were really into that kind of analysis. And we had coalitions with other local groups, that were doing things like giving away Nicaraguan coffee and things for donation and things like that. But then when I got into Kawahita, that sort of was really special. I read some quotes by Karenga from that book called Black Studies in the University was edited, an edited volume from the Yale conference. And I read the Q&A and the way that Karenga had this rapid fire.
Yeah.
I mean, you usually can't hear a SmackDown. You can't read a SmackDown. You have to see it or hear, right? I could read the SmackDown. Dude asked a question. He said, I think you might want to rephrase that. I would concede that. I was like, whoa, wow, what am I reading? So I put it all together. And so this was a very special time. It was sort of Afrocentricity was jumping. Black bookstores were at a kind of height in the 90s, a little renaissance there. Study groups, hip hop was politicized. So we were in a whole mode at that point. And so that's how I got into Kawaida. And then I promised Gerald Shaka that if I ever got a PhD, I would write it on the history of that organization. My critique of us and Karenga, my critique of Karenga and his leadership style, and it wasn't just him personally. I try to make my critique much more about a certain style of leadership, which more he calls it strong central leadership. I call it more call to the personality, and that is something that came from me being so close to it. You know, in the university, they say if you step back, you get critique. You get objectivity arise because you're distant. I actually took another approach. I was so close to it that the contradictions were personal. So when you believe in something and you feel it and you're committed to it, that's when you stand. And that's why that last chapter in Fighting for Us, even though it's dealing with music, is called In the Face of Funk, because I'm actually talking about the kinds of things the kind of insight you get from being engaged rather than disconnected. And so that's where my critique came from. It came from me believing in the 7 principles, which I still believe are very positive and very uplifting. And if we practice them, we would have a great change. And if we insisted on a wider world that we live in, transform the wider world and its power structures to be shaped and act in accordance with the 7 principles, humanity would be in another place. I have no problem with that. But it was because of embracing those values, I start to ask certain kinds of questions where you start to say, wait a minute, if we're arguing this, why that? If we're a cultural nationalist organization, we're talking about cultural revolution. What is the apparatus that delivers? What do you seize control over to deliver? So I felt that Kawaida had been more of a theory that grown out of a highly mobilized period where if you just you're already in spaces, so you can say to people, this is what we need to do, that's what we need to do. But what happens now when you have to compete against MTV? You have to compete against all these disruptions that make cultural training outside of the movement, outside of the Hekalu, the cultural center. So then you ask yourself, okay, wow, the other contradiction was for me, the group is in Los Angeles. Los Angeles being the propaganda and popular cultural apparatus of the world in many ways. Why hasn't the organization been leaned in ways to at least get a certain kind of critical mass of influence in that direction? So there's all these things that came to mind, but for me being close to it. So I start to deal with music more in the book because artists named Mtume, who did Juicy Fruit, I Get to You, and all those Stephanie Mills hits, all of that is Mtume and the earlier days with his songwriting partner, Reggie Lucas.
Now was Mtume, did he have an association with Herbie Hancock? Because I remember I had this album where Herbie Hancock had taken the name Umwandisha.
Yes.
Umwandisha, yeah. So, okay. In fact, the album was called Kawaida, I believe. It was called
Kawaida by his uncle, Tootie Heath. So this is what happens. Really interesting story, which is something that Karenga and I disagreed on as far as it being relevant. I thought it was profound that Mtume was able to influence some of the baddest jazz musicians in the world to take Swahili names, do music around Kawaida concepts.
Yeah.
In fact, the Kawaida album has a Talasimu on the cover, right? That symbol of the US organization. So, but those were all things that I developed. So my critique also came from interviewing people in the organization. Prior to the book, all the critique that I heard was from rivals. I never heard a critique from people internal to the organization, which meant this is a different level. So the book really, Fighting for Us, does not satisfy two constituencies. If you think, the US organization leadership could do no wrong or didn't have fundamental contradictions, you're going to be upset. And if you think that they're just a group of monsters and agents, you're not going to be happy with the book anyway, which is why I've always felt very comfortable ground in it. And I have yet to have anybody challenge anything that I said in the book on a factual level. It's more like, why you talk about this, why you talk about that. So I didn't stop being a cultural nationalist, but when I moved to the book on James Turner, I still have music on my mind, but I'm interested now I saw how an organization deals with cultural revolution. What happens though when we build an institution that sees itself as a part of a liberated zone? How does the founding momentum from a movement establish itself? Is it able to perpetuate itself over time? And we can talk about that. Right. When I moved to writing about funk bands, I'm talking about communities and networks in ways that culture is shared and culture in relationship to the socioeconomic reality. So I can tell you what the apparatus was that we seized, that my elders seized to make the revolution of the black band, that cultural shift away from the vocalists in the front, from the Motown model, to the self-contained band. I can tell you what was seized. Rec centers were available. You had, obviously, jobs. You had a vibrant black public sphere, a public sphere that people's residential area also mirrored the places that they had spent their leisure time in. All of that is about institutions. That's not just about notes. So I don't see myself as ever venturing out from the fundamental question about how can we position ourselves in ways that black people are the ones that are in control of cultural production. And I think that when you say black nationalists, I probably leaned toward Malcolm X's. I know it's often challenged, but it's early
64 and forward, or
the politics
of bullet
control. When he says, what is black nationalism? It means that we'll control this, control that. I think there is everybody has different ideas about the pathway to revolution. Even Du Bois and others kind of hint at there are some elements of bourgeois reform, what more scientific socialists would call bourgeois reform, not as a juxtaposition, but as a spin of the wheel in that direction.
A continuum,
as part of a continuum. So that's sort of where I saw it. But I mean, at that time, I didn't anticipate the direction of things moving so far to the right.
Yeah.
That now bourgeois reform seems like a fantasy. So I didn't have that in mind, but I felt like what cultural nationalism did was give me the capacity to ask these kind of questions. But I was in Marxism first, actually studying with Elias Mandela, the Malawian African scholar at University of Rochester. And then also Tom Saylor, who was a Caribbeanist, studied Cuban history there. So, Cuban history was what I studied with Thomas Saylor. So I was really into all of that first. But Kawaida had a kind of structure that satisfied some of the things I felt with Marxism. But I think I dispensed after coming out of Keita with the idea that you have to have a singular grand theory that does that.
Okay.
That's where my own maturity and maturation had to come. And then also loyalty to a person of a principle. Those things change, brother, but I have nothing but respect for that political and intellectual project and tradition that I was honored to be able to write about.
I definitely appreciate that. And it's always important to trace the ways in which we came to a particular philosophy and the way in which we became more open to the world. But Scott, I got you here, and you're a musician.
Yes.
Right. Mm-hmm. And while I am concerned about trying to get a sense of how you went from music as an avocation to writing about music as a vocation, but I got you here, and you actually have some pieces that you can play for us and discuss. So why don't you select a piece and give us a minute or so of it, and then tell us what you're doing and the context.
Okay, sure. It's interesting because I've been writing music for quite some time, but didn't always have the confidence to record and put music out. What's beautiful about this moment is that you don't have to have a record deal to put music out. So the first album that I produced and worked with was with one of the major cultural nationalist poets of the 1970s, Kalamu Yasalam from New Orleans. I met with him, and we had jammed together at a funk conference. I brought my bass to a funk conference, and we had a jam. He and I just jammed, and he was so extemporaneous and so in tune with where I was going. I said, man, I'd love to record with him, and he encouraged me to do so. So we put an album out called Catfish and Yellow Grits. You can find that, Kalamu Yasalam. Here's a song I did, kind of a mid-tempo song that I'm even use that music again for an R&B cut that I'm working on called Serenity. This is called I Thought of This. I'll play a little bit of that. Let me know if you can hear it.
I thought of this as I passed in the hallway, and you looked up while drying off after stepping out of your Sunday shower. In a lover's eye, one can see something, perhaps a glint of the potent beauty we all long to be when we giddily cast our fate to the whims of desire. And even if we have never pranced high-stepping at the front of satisfaction's parade, most of us have nevertheless stood close enough to the drumming to reflect the shudder of sensuality curled within the trembling of impatient flesh, awaiting the release of touch. I thought of this as I passed in the hallway, and you looked up while drying off after stepping out of your Sunday shower. Who needs to apologize for feeling good, for opening the soul to the bliss experience, especially when we consider our hearts observe neither stopwatch nor timetable upon tasting the sincerity sweet of a tear or two when a special person voluntarily confesses their resolve to attempt to be better than the frailty we all inevitably are whenever carrying the ball of contradictions commonly called love. In this briefness, we transubstantiate, visit the angelic state, who's reaching, we humans are capable of grasping, but oh, so seldom achieved. I thought of this as I passed in the hallway.
Yeah, so that's I thought of this. So that was the first song that we did on that album. There, you see that he's doing storytelling. He's doing things that are common in traditional poetry. There's some people that might hear some Arthur Prysock in there. You hear some Barry in there. I mean, and so from his perspective, and there are some songs on the album, Catfish and Yellow Grits, that are just straight storytelling behind music. So his view is that spoken word is not one formula. You know, spoken word is word spoken in so many ways, and you get that real journey on that first album that I did with Kalamo. And then after that, I started doing things under Dr. Scott Brown featuring. And so Dr. Scott Brown, SCOT Brown, you can find me on pretty much all music platforms. I did a song called You Already Know. This one with featuring vocalist Chris Walker. So, you know, if you want to hear some of that, we can do that too, or we can keep talking. But that's sort of, I'm at a point now where my scholarship is also in tandem with my written scholarship is in tandem with my music. I really can't separate them because I think making music also means once I start to talk about music, I'm asking the kinds of questions that you can't really make when you're just dealing with music as a text per se. So like most scholars, when they deal with music, you know, they break down the lyrics, they talk generally about things, but this is another kind of engagement with it. I have a radical idea when talking to musicians, however, that I'd like to share. It's actually
please.
I'm gonna reveal the secret to how to do research on Black music. This is gonna stun you all now. Ask musicians about music. I know this is hard because you want to ask them who got high with who had sex with who, what kind of trauma they went through. I know you want to talk about, but just try talking to a musician about music, and I assure you, you get some very, very different results. And so that was part of what gave me the ability to really interview and dialogue with so many musicians from Dayton, Ohio, like Sugarfoot from the Ohio Players, Rest in Funk Heaven. Oh, he didn't talk to anybody because of that. He did very few interviews. I got through to Sugarfoot because I had interviewed some older blues musicians who taught him how to play. And so when they called him, he had to follow the chain of command. He said, all right, I'll talk to him. And then his first question was, man, do you play anything yourself? And I said, yes, I do, sir. I actually play the bass. Where is it? Now, interesting, I brought my bass with me on that trip to Dayton because I was concerned maybe a moment like that could happen where I interview one of my heroes and they want me to play. I said, sir, it's in the trunk. Go get it. So I go get the bass. And at that point, Sugarfoot had a stroke, so he couldn't play guitar anymore, but he had taught himself how to play piano. So he lets me plug up. His first question is a question that I'm sure I probably would not have gotten the interview had I not answered. He said, can you play Skin Tight? And as you know, Skin Tight is an iconic bass line, and you recognize it anywhere you'd hear it. Here's just to remind folks of what Skin Tight is. This is what I had to play for him.
Brother, you taking me back. You taking me back. Yeah.
Now, so I play that, right? This is the interesting part. I play that and he's satisfied. And then he says, can you play the bridge? Now, the bridge is something that a lot of people don't, because that groove is boom, 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 boom. So I go, it's a scale. Ba, da, 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 dee, da, da, da. So I ran through the scale. And then he stopped. He said, okay, keep practicing, young man. If you keep practicing, I think you might make you some money. We're now going to go on here with the interview. So that was the pledge process. That was the pledge process I had to go through. And, you know, it's been an exciting, that city and its musicians have been so generous in sharing and with me. It's I've been working on it forever, as I've interviewed about 200 people. So now I'm like saying, okay, enough is enough. Let me force myself to finish with what I have. And I'm working hard to do so, while I'm also putting out music at the same time and, you know, teaching and all the other things that we have to do, you know.
Scott, I can't wait for the book, man. But damn, that's amazing.
I
I
thought
need
you
you.
liked that story.
Oh, you know me so well.
I thought you liked that story, bro.
Brother, let's shift though. June is Black Music Month.
Yes.
And that's one of the reasons I have you here, because you are the guy to talk about Black music.
Mm-hmm.
But tell me something about the month. How did it come about?
Yes.
And, you know, given what just happened in terms of Juneteenth,
Yeah.
you know, whenever the capitalists and the people who run the U.S. imperialist state get their hands around anything, they corrupt it. So,
well, that's true. Yeah.
Is Black Music Month something more than just a money-making scheme on the part of capitalists?
I don't think so, and I don't think that, obviously, if we're dealing with Juneteenth as a Black tradition, right? We always have this issue being, and that's what's so unique about being an African people in the U.S., because what is special about the U.S.'s ability to maintain a certain amount of prestige in spite of the, you know, capital moving elsewhere, the outward migration to capital hasn't reproduced the number one cultural resource in the world as far as popular culture is concerned. That's largely African people in the U.S. All right, we just got it, whether it be it sports, be it music. So the Black Music Association, so you have this whole institutionalization of Black power, where you have professional organizations in medicine and libraries, all thinking about Black workers in these areas needing to organize and needing to influence the spaces they occupy. So just to back up about what changed with Black music in the 1970s is when you see really the rise of Black music divisions at major labels. Part of the reason why groups like Earth, Wind and Fire, groups like the Ohio Players, groups like Parliament Funkadelic, all these bands that represent a kind of golden age of what people call 70s funk and soul, especially in the, throughout the decade. Part of that story is Black music executives. So one music executive I studied for with Capitol Records, name is Larkin Arnold, and he's important all the way through Michael Jackson and Thriller, actually. But what he was able to do as Black music head, and he was a Howard University graduate, is he had the ability to sign artists himself. Now, the budgets were smaller, but there's a certain level of autonomy of these executives that usually come out of radio or management, something connected to the community sensibility. So all these groups flourish in a period. Now that changes and starts to come under duress in the latter 70s. The Black Music Association is formed in the latter 1970s into the early 80s. And they are trying to organize all these Black executives to be able to leverage power in ways that model what's happening, let's say, with the Country Music Association. That's trying to have a Black power sensibility in terms of organizing economic and cultural resources. The problem is, so many of the people who were part of the Black Music Association were also, I mean, you have people who are very autonomous, like Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff, right, at Philadelphia International. They had a lot of autonomy, or Dick Griffey with Solar Records. But then you also have people that are executives for Warner Brothers and big corporations that don't have the room to have the same kind of protest sensibility. So that's where things start to change. And then in
let me back up. When you say things start to change, are you suggesting that so Motown dies, Philly International also declines, and so are we talking about the decline of autonomous Black music companies and the rise of Black music divisions within the large conglomerates?
They actually happen concurrently. So
Okay.
you have because Motown, is still a massive achievement through the 1970s. But boutique labels like Motown, boutique labels like Buddha Records, and are starting to feel the crunch. Black executives who actually had some kind of high point watermark in the 70s are also, as Black executives, are producing, industry saving artists like Michael Jackson. Obviously, the idea that's going to just stay over in the Black division is going to be challenged. So while that's happening, you have the buying up of smaller companies, and beyond buying up the companies, the buying up of distribution networks. You used to have different distributors that a smaller label could make a deal with, right? That number, the labels start to the big five, which becomes the big four, and then the big three. They also end up taking control of distribution as well. And so now you mirror that with the coming deregulatory sensibilities of the 80s, which is going to do similar kind of things to Black radio. You also look at the decline, already we're dealing with the decline of local record stores for chains, and then those end up, so all these things take the consumption and the choices that communities make around what music is played, what gets into the soundscape, out of Black hands. Let me just give you an example. There's some songs in Rochester. The Rochester's radio station is called WDKX, stand for Douglas, King, and X. It's still there now to this day. There are songs that I thought were complete global hits that were only played in Rochester because the DJs there liked it. I didn't know that. So if you don't know the song, "We're Here, Sun is Here," I'm thinking, what's wrong with you? Or Firecracker by Mass Production. That song was played that whole summer. Pop Lockers, everybody. That was like an anthem in Rochester. Not the case in every other community because of the art. So you have the perfect storm of the loss of self-determination on the part of the labels, and also in distribution, and also in the basic retail aspect of consuming product. Now, interestingly enough, now that's dealing with funk and soul. Hip hop, though, starts very organic and has that mom and pop aspect that had already been lost on the part of soul and funk. The only label that endures in the 80s that's Black owned and really has major success is called Solar Records, the sound of Los Angeles Records. A deeply political label, not in terms of the music, but what it would do with its resources in terms of raising money for Frelimo and supporting the anti-apartheid struggle under Dick Griffey. But Shalimar, The Whispers, Midnight Star, Lakeside, Climax, all those artists are on Solar Records. The Deal, which Babyface comes out of.
Yeah.
That's all Solar Records. And so that's sort of the Motown of the 80s, but it's in a very, very, very difficult and different music marketplace. But hip hop, though, ends up doing a lot of the kinds of localized things that were happening before. And so that's where things kind of shift.
Now, you touched on a number of things, geography, distribution, capitalist conglomerates, and they're just simply buying up those innovative spaces of Black music. And what it reminded me of is an old book written by Nelson George, The Death of Rhythm and Blues.
Classic.
Classic, right? Classic. And George makes the argument. We actually had him over the house and we watched the Knicks game one year. Yeah. I'm a Knicks fan.
Incredible mind.
Yeah. Oh, incredible. But George makes this argument that the innovation in Black music is tied to place and also tied to Black controlled companies. And so what I take, the place question is you think about the blues or jazz, you think New Orleans. You think about the blues, you're thinking Memphis, right? You think about R&B, you're thinking Chicago, Detroit, Philly. And so that there's a spatial place that speaks to the nature of those communities, those industrial communities, and the things that you talked about before in terms of Black working class. But then there's this question that in spaces that we have control over, creativity is fostered. So the question that raises for me is this. For the most part, we no longer control the sites in which our music is being produced. It's now, for the most part, overwhelmingly corporate. Is there an impact on the nature of the creativity? And one of the things that, just respond to this.
Okay.
I take the fact that the lack of groups, bands, right, suggests perhaps a moving away from the communal collectivist spirit that has always animated us as an African people.
Okay, let me try to answer this in a couple of ways. One is, when you say geography, most of those places that you mentioned, Chicago, Detroit, Memphis, that's actually an entrepreneurial geography, not a cultural geography.
Okay,
because
elaborate.
Their entrepreneurial activity is what attracts musicians. So Otis Redding is not from Memphis.
Right,
okay,
right.
He comes to Memphis. Marvin Gaye is not from Detroit. He's from DC. He comes to Detroit. So what you're really talking about is actually the entrepreneurial organization. But let me just give you an example of a city that is so rich in creativity that still has a band tradition to this day that most people are not aware of. Washington, D.C. Go-go music.
Go-go music.
That's right. But because it's not a place that developed an entrepreneurial apparatus and the culture is not interested in that. That is a live, performed art form that you consume there, right? You might get they call PA tapes. The tapes that were the PA engineer would take from a live show and then they would distribute those. But that was not the goal. Now, what's so interesting, if you think about hip hop, the first kind of hip hop innovators were shocked, alarmed, and not impressed with the first rap record and didn't really think Grandmaster Cass and Melly Mel were doing stuff in live, performed, communal spaces. And then when Sylvia Robinson, a Black executive R&B era, finds a way to codify it in music, recorded music, it takes a while for it to actually line up. And so I was watching this really funny documentary where Melly Mel saying, we hated that. That was a mockery of what we were doing, actually. And so, that's the one part I want to say about geography. The other thing I want to say is that I think the present moment is actually more interesting than any moment I've ever seen. Because,
really?
yeah, I think community is defined differently. And look, I want to state the obvious. Look at the community we're building right now. That's the same way musicians are building community. They have to, so that you have artists now, like, I know y'all out there in TV land thought I was a lot younger, but I'm 55. I understand that. What does a 55-year-old teacher have as a shot at making any music? Why would you do that? Well, this moment actually has opened things up to a degree that the kind of gatekeeping that was happening before, where you had to be a certain age, you had to do X, Y, and Z, that's no longer the case. You have people now making music and getting followings independently. So I actually find the moment we're in is actually really special. And what's happened is it changes so fast that the kind of corporate consolidation, it literally cannot keep up with it. Now, of course, we know how some of these stories likely end, but it's gone for a minute now. First, there was Napster, right? And consumers not even purchasing music. So now the companies are not even making money selling records. They might be selling concerts. They might be selling other things that go with it. Maybe branding. You might be selling liquor with the artist's, name on it. You might be selling license. All these intricate ways that actually make the landscape much more crowded, but much more artist friendly if you are not chasing. The problem is that the way in which we've internalized the, big break syndrome. This is my big break. I'm about to blow up. But there are artists out here now that probably I could not have seen when I was younger that are living a middle class, upper middle class life, selling music to a defined group of people.
Yeah.
And you and I have never heard of these folks. This is the funny thing. I've never heard of these.
Yeah.
And so that's the part I think when you ask me, are there things going on communally around that? Those networks, and even the way we think about geography, since you mentioned it, space. This is more like sunrise space than it is right? In the sense that we're connecting across geographies based on shared values. We're finding people to connect with, and somehow Black creativity is persisting and finding new avenues of expression. So that might make me more of an optimist in that regard. I think those are the kind of possibilities that inspire me.
Okay, I'm really impressed with the way that you were able to find that positive kernel in this situation, because you're right. I met a sister maybe 15 years ago who I'd never heard of, but she was making a living. I think she said that she made something in the neighborhood of $300,000-$400,000 a year, putting out her own records, running her own website, and touring largely outside the United States.
Right. And that was not available when I was growing up. All I wanted was a record deal. I'm sure, like everybody else, I would have signed anything they put before me. I wouldn't have even thought to ask a lawyer. I would have signed it, and we'd have a similar story, like the kind of stories you see on the series Unsung that I was a commentator, where we didn't know, because that was what people imagined. We didn't have other possibilities. And one thing that's so interesting about hip hop, the hip hop mentality of saying, if you don't play my songs on the radio, I'm going to make a mixtape and sell them. You're not feeling me, I'm going to go here. That was a spirit that was really, really important for the kind of adaptive ways that we've had to deal with these new contexts in which music is consumed, and how can we continue to have our voice heard.
But does it matter that so much is individualized? I know that the background, is always group, but I grew up in an era where you had the Temptations, you had funk bands,
Mm-hmm.
when I look across the landscape today, there's an individual.
Yeah.
And does that matter? Because, I'm thinking about what Baraka had to say about Black music. There's something about our music that is also our politics, right? And the way we move in the world.
That's true.
Can you talk
well,
about how we knit back through the culture ways that are liberatory, that will resist corporate capital and its perversion of our culture?
No, you're absolutely right about this challenge. And I think it has to do with the deeper social context that we're in. So I was I had a scenario for my students that I talked about that they thought was absurd. I said, I grew up in a day when you could be in your house, somebody knock on your door, and it's one of your friends walking by. They didn't call you, they didn't let you know. And they said, wait a minute now. What? I said, think about that. And then this just sounds like something simple, right? No, it's a cognitive leap for them to imagine it being anything other than danger for an unexpected knock on your. Because they said, well, what if you were busy? Well, you come to the door, you crack and say, hey man, I'm busy now. But it wasn't like people gonna go to a phone booth and call you because they were on your block. They say, hey man, and then sometimes they catch you. Oh man, you sit on your porch. If your house was too dirty, you didn't clean up like your mama told you to, then you might greet them on the porch. But the point is that kind of physicality of Black community, the physicality of it. I mean, I think, what COVID did was even make individual kind of space even more dramatic, but the physicality of social space, congregation, what does it mean to congregate in the reality that we're in? What is the cultural consequence of the lack of congregation, right? And I think those things, you're absolutely right about the dialectic or connection between the two, but it's not just going to be with music. It's going to be so many other things. I mean, I don't want to get into people's business because I know you folks are doing some things out here, but online dating is another example, right? You're not going to a party and meeting somebody, right? All those ways that people, and I'm certainly not critiquing it. I'm just saying that those are all examples that parallel what's happening with music that really show where we're spending time, how we're connecting with people. There are some really exciting possibilities, but there are some loss there. There's a lot of loss there as well.
Scott, we got some questions, and I want to get you to respond to 2-3 questions, and then I want to close with you playing a piece and talking about it. So we might go a little bit longer than 8:15.
I'm down.
Okay.
I'm here for it, brother. I'm here.
Okay, good, brother. Good, because this is wonderful.
Let's go.
All right. So a couple of questions. One from James Thompson, and his concern is, will real instruments make a comeback in the recording of albums?
I think they already have to a certain degree. One thing that's happened with the high price, once artists realized that they could make big money collecting on samples, then we had, especially in the 90s, with West Coast hip hop, which was much more grounded in funk, the popular use of what's called interpolation, where artists actually play parts that are very close to the song, but it's not actually a sample. So that kind of brought a lot of musicians back as well. Also, there's a certain way, one thing that, and Kanye West, of course, is very important as a producer. So some of the real innovative producers do a lot of digital things, but also still use live music as well. It's just more the approach is a little different. So, you're not going to hear the kind of bridges, modulations, and things that we used to hear in records, but live music is there. But it's just the impact that hip hop has had on the world. Historians to come are going to be really blown away by trying to figure it out, because even when you listen to R&B now, a lot of the modeling, a lot of the sound structures are modeling what's happening with hip hop. So the hip hop producers had a tremendous effect on music in general. So yes, live music is here. My lament is the point that you had, Professor Cha-Jua, and that is the loss of the band.
Yeah.
The band as a unit. And now
Yes.
where do we still see bands? We see them in church, gospel musicians, still there. We see them in specialized areas. But there was a time, and see, here's the argument I have, and this is where critical race theory comes into play for music as well. We don't have music executives to protect the band. But I'm gonna do a test. All of y'all out there watching, turn on Jimmy Kimmel, turn on Saturday Night Live, and I guarantee you, in a short amount of time, you will see a white band. In spite of the fact that there's because there are people in the industry committed to preserving the rock band as a sacred unit, a classic unit. So they're going to go overseas and find a Coldplay or a group like that. The last two major bands that had kind of investment in R&B were Mint Condition and Tony. Now you got some other bands here and there, and you got blends of bands like hip hop bands like The Roots. They're phenomenal. But my point is that no matter what's happening, the rock band is enshrined in American popular music. Even if they only know 2 or 3 chords and can't sing, they're going to. How many times have you turned and you said, "Who are these people? What is that? I never heard of. Who is that?" And it was the greatest thing, jang-ling-ling, and then that's it. But we don't have that because there isn't the insiders, institutional structural support that says, you know what, we need a new, who's the next Earth, Wind, and Fire? See, so we are much more subject to whatever is selling as opposed to what can you preserve in spite of its immediate profits. So we're our recorded music is much more vulnerable to whatever is hot at the moment. Okay, so everybody's a group. We need a new Boys and Men. Oh, Beyonce's that. We need a new Beyonce. Oh, we need a new Usher. So as opposed to like, okay, this group is part of a continuum. Earth, Wind, and Fire was here. This group came here. This group came here. You can say that with the Grateful Dead. You can say that with the Beatles. The Beatles is the paradigmatic rock band that is still present in American popular music, whether you like it or not.
That's I think that's an awesome answer. I've got another question from Anthony D. And Anthony D wants to take you back historically. And his question is, why did black labels, DJs, and record executives turn their nose up at hip hop? And I want to amend that because Def Jam, they also went to BET first.
Sure.
And they turned them down, right? Is there a conservatism amongst these black record executives that actually ended up stifling some innovation?
Well, you know what? I don't think it stifled innovation. I think it actually
provoked, I think send it elsewhere.
I think it provoked innovation. And one thing, first of all, the questioner is absolutely right that if you look at, for instance, Curtis Blow, who performed on Soul Train, Don Cornelius says right in the thing, I don't really understand this rap thing. And I'm from upstate New York. I'm not from New York City. And I'm going to, now see, people have to be, it wasn't just the executives that felt this way. Because in many cases, the first exposure to rap or what became hip hop was through Rapper's Delight. Rapper's Delight is a novelty record. And so it was very easy to think this was a one-off. And when I was in Rochester, New York, I could not, and being a musician at 14 years old, I could not wrap my head around, because we still had bands in Rochester. I couldn't wrap my head around somebody making a record talking over Chic's music, because that was not a sample of Good Times. That was actually musicians in the studio playing Good Times. Doug Wimbish, Skip McDonald, all those folks in Sugar Hill Records. So there was this early phase. Now, I started to get into it more when Curtis Blow, because he had this really original music. But at the first, I think Rapper's Delight was, if that's how you got introduced to the culture, it was not unreasonable to believe it was a fad. And the executives definitely did not like it. Black executives didn't like it. They thought it was, and it also was music that was coming from these smaller boutique labels. See, this Rapper's Delight didn't come out on Epic. It didn't come out on Harrison. It didn't come out on Capitol. It came out on Sugar Hill Records, which, and a lot of those original records mimicked even what hip hop artists would have to do. They were sold out of the trunk. If you listen to Nile Rodgers' story about, the whole thing with Sugar. So anyway, but still there was intransigence. There was reluctance. There was a generational divide. I also think that part of the problem was the way that hip hop was coming from Black youth and Black cultural expression that didn't have the kind of deference to the industry. And that's why I said, actually, I think their attitude provoked creativity, because that was a group of people that said, we don't need you. You're not going to play us on radio? We'll find our own way to circulate it. And when I was in school in the 80s, I remember this brother named, he goes by Hashim Shamari now. But when he came to campus in 1984, 85 with the name on his belt and the hoodie with the fur, I thought that dude was doing something wild. Okay, that was not something that my aesthetic was ready for. It can't go, because a lot of this was regional. This was a New York City thing at first. And because, now this gets back to your question about geography. Switch the cities. Just imagine this, people. We're going to speculative work here. What if go-go music was in New York and hip-hop was in D.C.? What I mean by that is we have youth cultures that are creating all kinds of sounds in different places, some of which we never get to hear, styles that we don't see. But because of also the proximity of being in a place that had record labels. So if let's say we got our own style in Rochester, New York, and we're doing this thing, we're dressing our own way and playing music, there's not an executive that's going to pass by and say, I'm going to make a record out of that. You're in Rochester. You're in Toledo. You're in Youngstown. You know what I mean? You're in Tulsa. So the relationship that New York has to the production of culture and the forces that produce it. So we can't just tell the story as if it's a meritocracy, that the Lion won because the Lion was stronger. The Lion was well positioned to win, and it was a tremendous, powerful victory for Black people and humanity, for hip hop to have done what it has done. Let's not mistake that. But there's also things in history that are not born of just the art itself. It's also born of circumstance.
Great. Scott, we want to close this out. Yes. And so I want you to play a piece and then just give us a bit of a, tell us about the piece, and we'll bring it to an end.
You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to play, since we ended talking about hip hop, I'm going to play a hip hop piece that I did. It's called Scot Tronics. Now, the rapper on this is O'Henny Savant, who's it's funny because now hip hop is going through what funk is going through. To actually have bars and rhyming and poetic configuration and innovation in hip hop is something that people who are inspired by the 90s are trying to preserve, believe it or not. So this artist was in town in LA. He had a meeting with a big time producer who delayed the meeting. I knew he was in town. So I said, hey man, well, let's hang out. He said, okay, I ain't got nothing to do. I'll come by. So he comes by. He didn't know I had my track. I was like, I have this track. This could be it. I had my track ready for him. And I didn't say, hey, listen to my track. He said, hey man, you got any beats? I said, oh, funny you should ask that. So I played the beat, and he actually looked around the room and started rhyming to what he sees. I got pictures of Parliament and stuff like that on my wall. So this became the song Scottronics, Dr. Scott Brown, featuring O'Henny Savant.
I'm the artisan listening to Parliament, rocking the cardigan, teaching you the art of this. MC culture while they celebrate the 808s. I rep the true school and rap in a major way, while the pioneers fade away. Day to day, raps alumni, day to day. Things have changed, no more Sunday make it rain. Like they say, things can never remain the same. So I reminisce on when sentences were intimate, beats were different. That sentiment, that's what I'm giving this. That's where it started. That's how I'm flipping it. That's the true artist. Scottronics, Savant got phonics. I fuse metaphysical things with ebonics.
That's why I had to pull this out on him. I started walking.
Scottronics, Savant got phonics. One. Scottronics, Savant got phonics. One that you want to listen to. Scottronics, Savant got phonics. I fuse
metaphysical things with ebonics. And I did.
One that you want to listen to. One that you want to listen to. Come on. I slay 1,000 with a jawbone. My bad, a microphone, kind of device you talk on. I'm a dog on steroids. Airborne cats get paranoid. Clairvoyant with the lyrics, boy. I can enunciate thoughts with a clear voice. Always G&E rights, way into the weed night. Hours while I'm killing the beats, MC life. Walking the place while they walking the bass. Jazz cafe with taste, smoke all in your face. It feels good, don't it? Soul snaps to the rhythm. That's what they wanted, well, that's what we give them. One that you want to listen to.
So that's a little slice of Scottronics. Savant got phonics. We fuse metaphysical themes with ebonics. That's that funktronics. I was walking the bass. I walk that bass like I walk in the place. All right? It speaks for itself. So that's the vibe we were in, and it was very much a product of what has gotten me through much of what has gotten me through life. My enthusiasm usually outweighs my capacity, but people give me a break because they just are so amused by it. They say, let me give this brother a chance. Let me see what you got. And that's gotten me this far, and I think it's probably going to be the case for the whole run.
Brother, I appreciate your self-deprecation, but let me say, I'm loving it. The audience is loving it. I appreciate your willingness to stay on with me, and I got to have you back. Got to have you back.
Anytime, Sundiata. It's an honor and a pleasure, brother.
Thank you, brother. All right, so we're going. Let me get our music going as we go out. Here we go.